congratulations on the initiative. I think it's important that a dialogue be instituted on what we call the ethics of humanitarian intervention in academics. You know, a few years ago I was a part of a project which brought together, funded by the Carnegie Foundation, New York, which brought together leading human rights NGOs and humanitarian NGOs and scholars. So in the first phase of the project, leading NGOs talked about, international NGOs talked about the way, the moral choices they make, when to intervene, how to intervene, what dictates their intervention. And in the second phase of the project, scholars responded to the kind of moral choices that are made by NGOs. We found, much to our consternation, that actually there was very little meeting ground between practical choices, which are made ethically, but which are dictated by certain degrees of constraints, and the critical perspective which is brought to bear upon the non-profit sector or civil society by scholars. To give you a very brief example, a friend of mine who's a leading philosopher at Yale, Thomas Fogge, who's put poverty onto the map of political philosophy in the West, asked NGOs, he said, why do you not intervene in the 4 poorest countries? He named India as one of them, Bangladesh, and a couple of others, and get rid of poverty. He's passionately dedicated to removing poverty. And he was attacked. I mean, he was attacked by a number of very distinguished representatives saying, you guys have no idea where we have to intervene. We have to intervene where we have to intervene in happening places. We have to intervene in response to what our donors expect of us. In short, ethical constraints are mediated by very pragmatic recognition of possibilities and problems. The second problem that we found, and I personally found with the kind of moral choices that Human Rights Watch makes, and in my naivety I took on Ken Roth, the executive director, who responded to me very sharply in the book which was published by Cambridge University Press, what about agency, about the people who set out to help? You know, if you look at major civil society campaigns, global civil society campaigns, for example, Make Poverty History. And if you remember that a few years ago on BBC, you had all these celebrities from Hollywood coming on the screen and every 5 minutes snapping their fingers and saying, a baby is dying in Africa, do something about it. And the Africans were furious. I mean, very good, well-intentioned, very good-hearted, by falling into what we normally call the pornography of poverty. In short, what I want to illustrate is that it's going to be interesting hearing an academic who has done a PhD on civil society and humanitarian, the politics and the ethics of humanitarian intervention, speak on this task, right? So welcome, Urvashi, and I look forward to hearing you. About 14 minutes, will that be with that?
Thank you, Neera. Am I audible? Thank you for that introduction. So what I'm going to try and do in the next 40 minutes is lay out how India understands and practices humanitarianism, the principles guiding its humanitarian programs, the manner and means through which aid is delivered, and its broader engagement with the formal humanitarian system. And the aim, I want to say, is not merely to find avenues through which the international system can better engage with India or cooperate with India, but also try to consider India's understanding of humanitarianism on its own terms. And in order to do this, in the first part of this talk, I'll lay out a history of India's development assistance that might seem that it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but the reason I bring out this point about development assistance is because India has historically not made a distinction between humanitarian and development aid. So to look at how it conceptualizes development aid also gives us a clue into how it thinks about humanitarianism. In the second part, I will look at humanitarian assistance specifically, and the third part, I'll look at the drivers of Indian foreign policy and how it translates to its understanding of humanitarianism and its implications for India as a humanitarian donor in the 21st century. So to start with, perhaps the first thing that needs to be said is that India is not a new donor. India has been providing overseas development assistance since the time of its independence. India's leadership post the British rule believed that India had a manifest destiny to be a model and catalyst for other developing nations. Great faith was also invested in the spirit of brotherhood and solidarism amongst other post-colonial states. To give you an example, on the day of Burmese independence in 1948, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, proclaimed that, as in the past, so in the future, the people of India will stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Burma, and whether we have good fortune or ill fortune, we shall have it together, we should share it together. So India's post-independence development programs was seen as a means to establish solidarity between southern states sharing a similar history and common development challenges. However, development assistance was conceptualized as bringing mutual benefit to both states and not a form of one-way charity. India thus employed the term development partnerships over foreign aid to indicate that aid was not part of an unequal donor-recipient relationship, but a mutually beneficial partnership between states sharing a common history and identity and facing similar economic hurdles. The formal framework for Indian Development Cooperation was built with the Colombo Plan of 1950, which established a framework for South-South cooperation based on technical cooperation and the sharing of development experiences. And Indian development assistance focused on technical assistance, technology transfers, the training for civil servants, and grants for specific projects. And these programs were all based on a request from the partner state and in line with demands identified by the partner state. Moreover, unlike some of its DAC donors, aid was not tied to any political or economic conditionalities. In the early 1950s, India also signed the Panchayat Treaty, which articulated the principles of mutual respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty for governing relations between states. And this framework of non-interference in a country's political affairs and a focus on economic causes of underdevelopment and focus on technical assistance and technology transfers have been the guiding framework for Indian development cooperation. And the early years of Indian development partnerships took the form of multi-year loans and technical assistance programs, and which, while small in number, helped build goodwill for India in the region. In 1964, India created the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, ITEC, which has been its flagship development assistance program till the early 2000s. It was again conceptualized as a program of mutual benefit based on solidarity, sharing, and cooperation. And importantly, once again, it was demand-driven by the recipient country. That is, it's based on a request by the recipient state for technical assistance. It was fully funded by India, but did not have any conditionalities attached to it. India's overseas development programs today continue to be demand-driven and untied, and we can discuss this further in the discussion, the extent to which they are untied. But for the time being, I propose that they continue to be demand-driven and untied, based on the principles of partnership and mutual benefit. Shyam Saran, former Indian Foreign Secretary, I think articulates India's official approach quite well. He describes India's current approach in terms of a partnership for mutual benefit, whose objective is to create a high level of capacities, enabling the relationship to be expanded and upgraded in subsequent states. So rather than promoting a patron-client relationship that suggests unequal dependency, instead of prolonging dependency, the objective would be to create a mutually beneficial interdependency. And that has continued to be the focus of India's development programs even today. Until recently, India did not have a separate department managing development assistance. It's only recently that it's in 2012 that it set up the Development Partnership Administration called DPA. But DPA, as some of you might know, is hosted within the MEA, and decision-making within the DPA is closely related to the foreign policy of the MEA to a particular country. And DPA now has three divisions: one which deals with project appraisal and line of credit, two which deals with capacity building schemes, disaster relief, and the ITEC program, and DPA 3 which focuses on project implementation. So already the structure of DPA should indicate that there isn't actually a separate body for decision-making on humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian assistance decision-making is done alongside with, for an example, the ITEC scheme or capacity building or broader development programs. So the reason that I've spent these few minutes talking about India's development partnership, despite the title being humanitarian donorship, is to emphasize the commonalities between India's development approach and humanitarian approach. So just to recap quickly, what we see in India's development partnerships is that the emphasis is on mutually beneficial aid, aid that is demand-driven, aid that is untied, and aid that is respectful of the principle of non-interference. And we see a strong continuity between these principles and those principles guiding India's humanitarian donorship. And obviously this stands in stark contrast to the principles guiding the formal humanitarian system, of which the ICRC is in some sense a gatekeeper. So to turn now specifically to India's humanitarian donorship. So India's aid budget has grown considerably over the past decade, doubling from about $300 billion in 2007 to about $700 billion in 2012. But only a very small portion of this is allocated to humanitarian assistance. India's humanitarian budget is actually about $40 million, which corresponds roughly to the humanitarian budget of Luxembourg. Most of India's humanitarian assistance is allocated to its regional neighbors, so primarily Bhutan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Maldives, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. The remaining one-third is shared between different geographic regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. India's most visible humanitarian engagement was its response to the Indian Ocean tsunami, where India not only dispatched aid to Sri Lanka, but also refused external aid for affected areas in India. As I mentioned earlier, decisions about humanitarian assistance are made by the geographical and functional divisions of the MEA under the overall supervision of the Foreign Secretary. So there's no separate decision-making process or policy framework for humanitarian issues, and decisions about humanitarian aid allocation and programming are often made on a case-by-case basis, but reflective of India's broader foreign policy towards the country. As I mentioned already, since 2012, this humanitarian decision-making falls under DPA. And I think a statement by a Joint Secretary in 2012, a Joint Secretary of DPA, illustrates the trend in how humanitarian decision-making works. So, an unnamed secretary stated that DPA will only implement policies given by the political wing of the MEA, the minister, the foreign secretary, the secretaries, and the territorial divisions. So once again, there is no independent policy-making process for humanitarian aid allocation. But we should also note that the MEA is not the only relevant actor as far as India's overseas humanitarian assistance goes. The Ministry of Defense, for an example, employed the Indian military in conjunction with the National Crisis Management Committee, which is an interministerial coordination forum to provide humanitarian aid in Sri Lanka and the Maldives. The National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA, which is housed within the Ministry of Home Affairs, dispatched a national disaster response to Japan following the earthquake in 2011. Indian multinationals operating in countries affected by disaster have also started to contribute relief materials as part of their corporate social responsibility initiatives, and Indian pharmaceutical companies have made significant donations of medicines and medical equipment. India does not, however, provide funding for relief activities to the Indian Red Cross Society or to Indian or international NGOs operating overseas. So that was in terms of giving you a background of how much aid is contributed, where that aid goes, how the decision-making process works in the MEA as far as humanitarian assistance goes. The next point that I want to make is an argument that I want to put forth, which is that India practices a form of state-based humanitarianism. And I'll explain this in the next few minutes. So, India's humanitarian assistance typically takes the form of in-kind goods, such as food assistance, construction materials for shelter, pharmaceuticals and medical teams, or direct cash gifts. India, for example, provided $5 billion in in-kind relief for the 2008 earthquake in China. It ran a hospital in Iran after the 2005 earthquake. It provided relief supplies to the victims of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and provided relief assistance to Jamaica following Hurricane Ivan, amongst numerous other examples. This humanitarian assistance decision-making is shaped by a combination of beliefs, interests, and pragmatism, which closely follows the parameters of India's development partnership. So India's humanitarian programs are once again framed as a symbol of friendship, as a goodwill gesture between southern states. So India emphasizes that humanitarian assistance must be provided with the consent of the recipient state, in line with the principles of sovereign equality and non-interference. India's humanitarian programs are also demand-driven and need-based in response to requests made by the recipient state. Assistance is primarily provided through bilateral channels directly to the affected state, who is then expected to take the lead in coordinating and dispersing aid. India typically does not provide aid to international organizations, contributing less than 2% of its humanitarian budget in 2011 to multilateral organizations. In discussions on the appropriate mechanism of humanitarian assistance at the UN General Assembly, India has also emphasized the development of national capabilities must be the starting point of disaster management. The state is seen as the appropriate recipient of humanitarian assistance, with all humanitarian relief activities coordinated through state institutions and mechanisms. India has also criticized attempts at UN reform which seek to coordinate humanitarian relief through UN-appointed humanitarian coordinators rather than the effective state. India has argued that the same should hold true for conflict situations, not just for disasters. The transitional activities in the case of protracted crises should also be undertaken under national ownership through the development of national capacities at all levels to manage this transition. So the effort for the focus of India's humanitarian assistance programs is on the development of national capacities and national ownership. Similar to its development partnerships, humanitarian assistance is not tied to recipient states' internal political structures or adherence to international human rights standards. This has meant that India has also provided humanitarian assistance to states believed to be authoritarian or undemocratic, as in Myanmar, with no requirement to change the domestic political condition. India has also been critical of the inclusion of protection activities as part of the humanitarian toolkit, and it has argued that while safeguarding rights is of paramount importance, the responsibility for protection lies with the state and must be defined through national laws and frameworks. So India has argued, for an example, that while it may not be a signatory to the International Refugee Convention, India's own protection regime for refugees is based on fundamental rights guaranteed by the Indian Constitution and other relevant legal bodies within India. Engagement with rights and protection issues is also seen as interference that can dilute the principle of state sovereignty and politicize humanitarian action. So the Indian model differs from that followed by northern states and northern agencies. Need-based aid is defined in terms of the request by the state rather than individual or community needs. And the responsibility for aid identification, allocation, and distribution is charged to the recipient state, non-international agencies like the UN or NGOs. The function of humanitarian assistance is to build national capacities with the affected state in the driving seat of aid decision making. The scope of humanitarian assistance also does not extend to addressing human rights violations within a state, and the state is seen as an ultimate guarantor of rights. So it's for these reasons that I argue that Indian humanitarianism can be understood as a form of state-based humanitarianism, whose function is not only to alleviate individual suffering, but assist the state in meeting humanitarian needs and building national capacities, which is organized around the principles of non-interference, consent, and demand-driven aid, and operationalized through in-kind or direct cash aid contributions through bilateral channels. What this has also meant is that India has been quite critical of what I would call maximalist humanitarian agencies. So humanitarian agencies that seek to integrate relief assistance which are concerned with long-term development, human rights, justice, institution building, peace building, and a number of other long-term societal transformation programs. This kind of approach is especially characteristic of a number of multi-mandate agencies that occupy the formal humanitarian system. So India is unlikely, I argue, to follow that form of humanitarianism, that of a maximalist humanitarianism, given its concerns about sovereignty, non-interference, and its understanding of the role of the state as the ultimate guarantor of rights. The final point I'd like to make, before I turn to the drivers of Indian foreign policy, is that India has also been extremely critical of the manner in which decision-making works within the formal humanitarian system. So India has frequently criticized the UN and international NGOs for assuming a decision-making role on the proper terms and mechanisms of humanitarian assistance, arguing that this power can only lie with states. So India has accused international humanitarian agencies for shifting the terms of humanitarian assistance from what has been agreed by states in the General Assembly Resolution 46-182, from shifting the terms of humanitarian assistance agreed by states to comply or be consistent with the mandates of international NGOs and international agencies. So for an example, India, in response to the report by the UN on system-wide coherence, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, India argued that we disagree with the report's recommendation asking the humanitarian agencies to clarify their mandates and to enhance their cooperation on IDPs. The mandates of UN agencies are clarified by member states. It is not for the agencies to assign mandates to themselves or to shed them. The purpose of this exercise, and here they were referring to the report on system-wide coherence, is to improve the system-wide coherence of the UN system and to improve the UN's coordination of humanitarian assistance But the intention of this UN adaptive reform cannot be to rewrite existing intergovernmental agreements. So a part of India's critique of the former humanitarian system has also been about decision making within that system. Who makes these decisions? And a deep skepticism of the manner in which decision making according to India has shifted from being made by states to being made by humanitarian agencies in terms of defining the function and the scope and the operational modalities of humanitarian assistance. So that gives you a brief kind of overview of what principles are driving India's humanitarian programs and the manner in which it interacts with the formal system. Typically, India, though, does not provide aid in conflict, right? So it actually typically uses the term disaster relief rather than humanitarian assistance. There's obviously two notable exceptions to this, right? Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, where India has provided humanitarian assistance in the midst of ongoing conflict. And in both these cases, India's humanitarian assistance model has been similar to its natural disaster model. So it's been demand-driven, been provided bilaterally to the affected state, and it's been in line with the needs and priorities identified by the state. So in Afghanistan, India runs a wide range of programs for education, medical services, transport, telecommunications, civil aviation, agriculture, and other major infrastructure projects. Its relief and rehabilitation programs are in line with the priorities identified by the Afghan state. Based on a request from the Afghan government recently, India began to focus on capacity building and human resource development to help accelerate institution building in Afghanistan. Most Indian aid is bilateral, and India does not participate in wider international relief efforts being run by the UN and World Bank. Indian aid to Afghanistan is based on their close historic relationship, the need to ensure that anti-Indian forces do not come back to power in Afghanistan, and India's economic, energy, and security interests in the region. In Sri Lanka, India, as I'm sure most of you are already aware, India has provided assistance for the relief and rehabilitation of IDPs through programs for the construction of houses and schools, developing railway infrastructure in the north, agricultural assistance, livelihood starter packs, and medical units. It has spent approximately $279 million for the building of 50,000 houses for IDPs recently, and this is one of India's largest humanitarian aid programs. India's response to the Sri Lankan conflict involved a moderation between meeting the needs of domestic Tamil interest groups and winning geopolitical favor with the Rajapaksa regime in Sri Lanka, especially in the context of China's growing influence in South Asia. The Sri Lankan government has been accused of violating international humanitarian law and standards for the welfare and protection of IDPs during its military campaign against the LTT and after the relief and rehabilitation phase. Critics have therefore charged that Indian aid to the Sri Lankan government violated the principles of impartiality and neutrality, as it was based on Indian political and economic interests and supportive of a government that had violated international humanitarian law. Indian aid also reduced the leverage of northern humanitarian donors and agencies to negotiate access and rights issues with the Sri Lankan government. India has also been criticized for shielding the Rajapaksa regime as it abstained from a US-sponsored resolution in 2014 calling for an international investigation into the alleged war crimes of the Rajapaksa government. India had supported similar resolutions in 2012 and 2013, but it abstained from the 2014 resolution, argued that it imposed an international investigative mechanism which ran against the foundational ideas and principles of the UN Human Rights Commission. India's use of the state-based model for disaster relief, as the example of Sri Lanka illustrates, is in necessary tension, I think, with the principles of the former humanitarian system, as the state is often a party to the conflict and a perpetrator of human rights abuses. Providing aid directly to the state, as in the case of Sri Lanka, can thus be seen as supporting a particular party to the conflict, and therefore a violation of humanitarian principles. But as long as India continues to believe that the state carries the primary responsibility for the management of internal conflict, welfare and protection, it is unlikely that India will bypass the state to provide aid directly to affected communities. India's conceptualization of humanitarian assistance, as I argued earlier, is not about meeting only individual humanitarian needs, but enabling the affected state to meet those humanitarian needs. It is also worth considering that there is no necessary connection between respect for humanitarian principles and meeting humanitarian needs. While India has been criticized for violating humanitarian principles, it is perhaps one of the actors most actively engaged in the rehabilitation of the Tamils, and doing more than a number of other states to actually secure the welfare of the Tamils. I think two further points are worth noting about India's assistance to Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, which has been criticized quite frequently by the international press and the former humanitarian system. First, India's aid, as I mentioned earlier, in Sri Lanka is consistent with its long-held support for the principles of sovereignty and non-interference. The manner in which it's delivered aid is consistent with those principles, as well as the practical concern that human rights standards need to be protected, that while human rights standards need to be protected, it is the state that is the ultimate guarantor of protection and of rights. The second point is that the conflicts in Afghanistan and Sri Lanka are similar in that they're about competition between a state and an internationally recognized terrorist group. Yet in the case of Afghanistan, humanitarian agencies and Western donors provided assistance to the Afghan state and government, and this is rarely considered a violation of the principles of impartiality and neutrality. The Indian government support to the LTT the Indian government supports the Sri Lankan government's campaign against the LTT, and the support that is extended to the government's relief and rehabilitation plan is qualitatively then not so different from Western government support of Afghanistan. In other words, the humanitarian standard that India has held to in Sri Lanka is violated by Western humanitarian agencies and Western humanitarian donors themselves in Afghanistan. India is in this sense only emulating the politics of a number of northern states who have shielded or promoted repressive regimes to secure their own political and security interests. How am I doing on time? Pretty good? Okay, great. Great. So, just to recap where we've gotten so far, I've given you an overview of the principles guiding India's humanitarian donorship, its aims, how it understands humanitarian assistance, as well as the two exceptions of Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, and highlighted how even though these are exceptions to its disaster relief model, they are actually consistent both with its disaster relief model as well as its understanding of sovereignty, the role of the state, and the manner in which international order is to be preserved in international society. I now turn to the drivers of Indian foreign policy and then relate this to Indian humanitarian donorship. So I'm sorry for one brief minute of jargon here. International relations theorists, they locate the sources of state behavior in either ideational or material factors. Right? So either state behavior is motivated by its interests, its material interests and its power, or it's motivated by its identity and its beliefs and its history and the norms and values that it holds. So scholarship on Indian foreign policy can be situated in these two groups. Some scholars argue that Indian foreign policy is a product of its national interest. Others argue that Indian foreign policy is a product of its identity. So I'm just going to look in turn at each of these arguments to see how best we can understand Indian humanitarian donorship in the context of these broader drivers of Indian foreign policy. So one school of thought suggests that Indian foreign policy is shaped by its identity, history, and its beliefs. Deepa Ullavali argues, for an example, that post-independence India's global identity has been mostly normatively driven as opposed to power-driven, and locates the sources of Indian foreign policy in its notion of civilizational exceptionalism, post-colonial nationalism, and secular democracy. So this civilizational outlook, Ullavali argues, is supported by a dominant historical narrative that sees India as being domestically tolerant and pluralist, and externally non-aggressive and non-interventionist, with its sphere of influence based on culture, values, and to some extent trade. Post-colonial nationalism fuses economic independence, strategic autonomy, and normative foreign policy in a grand design to stake out a definitive international presence as a deliberate opposition to Western powers. Other leading scholars of Indian foreign policy, like Kanti Bajpai or Pratap Bhanu Mehta, have all noted the centrality of Nehruvian thinking in contemporary Indian foreign policy. So the core of Nehru's understanding of international order was the principle of non-alignment, following from which, from Nehru, a just international order consisted of truly sovereign nation-states that are economically developed and are autonomous in respect to their foreign policies, that use violence only as a last resort to settle differences, and that operate rules and institutions democratically without great power manipulation, and that when necessary are helped economically by those better off by than themselves. So Nehru saw states as a primary form of political organization and the main acting subjects in the international system. International order was thus based on a system of sovereign and self-regulating states, with all people having a right to live freely under their chosen governments. He was also a proponent of the principles of Panchila, mutual respect for one another's territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So following on from these ideas, Nehru's argued that India's international engagement should take the form of positive mutualism, based on complete strategic and economic independence and a conscious distance from great power politics and balance of power games. So in this idealist view, or in this view that's based of this view of Indian foreign policy that locates the sources in India's identity and its beliefs and its values, it's India's experience of the former colony and suspicion of Western imperialism that has contributed to India's strong support for the principle of sovereign equality and non-interference. So India's post-independence leadership conceived of international order as one made of sovereign and self-regulating states, and this belief continues to be firmly embedded in Indian foreign policy. So how this translates to humanitarian policy, the implication of these beliefs for humanitarian policy is that first, India's aid is provided with the consent of the state. Second, aid is demand-driven, in line with the needs identified by the recipient state. Third, aid is not tied to internal political or social reform in the recipient state. And fourth, that the function of assistance is to build national capacities to address ongoing and future humanitarian crises. So these are the kind of ideational or identity-based currents that drive India's foreign policy and its humanitarian assistance programs. But there is another school of thought, and that other school of thought situates Indian foreign policy in realpolitik principles. It traces Indian foreign policy. Scholars writing in this tradition actually note a marked transition in India's foreign policy in the 1990s. They argue that perhaps before the 1990s, India's foreign policy was based on its identities and its belief and its history as a post-colonial state. But growing economic interdependence, India's nuclear diplomacy, its integration with the global financial system has meant that India has followed a more interest-based and more pragmatic foreign policy. So Raja Mohan is one of the leading scholars of Indian foreign policy, argues that India's appeal to principles and norms such as non-interference is actually a sign of India's weakness. It is a means through which India takes cover and shields itself against non-interference from greater powers in the international system. So in this way of thinking about Indian foreign policy, India's humanitarianism is based on its national political and economic and security interests. The principle of non-interference as a basis for international order is a means through which India fends off international involvement in its own conflicts in Kashmir and the Northeast. India's growing energy needs require it to have friendly and cordial relations with authoritarian states or repressive states. The concentration of humanitarian aid allocation in South Asia is intertwined with India's regional security concerns, whether in the form of the rise of anti-India Taliban factions in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the regional balance of power vis-a-vis China, or anti-India terrorist groups in Bhutan. At the same time, India's growing contributions to international humanitarian aid are linked to its quest for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. So what we have so far then is, I think, I'll make one further point before, because I anticipate it's going to be a comment later. So in this interest-based explanation of India's humanitarian policy, right, the realist would point out that India has in fact prioritized at times its political and security interests over the commitment to non-interference. So the most cited examples are India's intervention in East Pakistan to liberate Bangladesh in 1971 and Sri Lanka in 1987. Raja Mohan, for an example, even argues that most of India's neighbors would scoff at the idea that non-intervention is a high principle of Indian foreign policy. The Nepalese, for an example, would argue that Indian intervention, political intervention, is a part of their everyday life in Nepal. In Sri Lanka as well, India has historically been involved in the internal affairs of the Sri Lankan state with its shifting support for the entity and the Sri Lankan government. Similarly, India's aid programs in Afghanistan are also aimed at rebuilding of the Afghan state with the hope that the Afghan state will not pose a future threat to India's security. So some scholars have argued that India's violation of the principle of non-interference suggests that India has actually loved sovereignty only in word, but has been willing to consider it conditionally in deed. And this suggests that even India's humanitarian policy is driven by its political and security interests rather than any broader normative framework for humanitarianism. And in this sense, because India's humanitarian aid programs are driven by its political and security interests, India does not offer an alternative vision. Does not offer an alternative vision for humanitarianism. Right? That would be the argument up till now, that we have two kind of bodies of schools of thought that explain Indian foreign policy. One locates it in its identity and its history, another locates it in its interests, military, political, security interests. And we look at the history of India's engagement with South Asia, it would seem to suggest that a number of times its political and economic interests have actually trumped concerns about sovereignty and non-interference. And from that we may derive the conclusion that it has loved the principle of sovereignty only in word, but treated it conditionally in deed. And from that one might derive the conclusion that there isn't actually a normative framework guiding India's humanitarian donorship, that it will continue to be interest-based. And it's here where I'd like to make an intervention in this debate. State interest, right, and I don't want to go into a lot of really boring international relations theory and put you all to sleep, but just to sum up many years of international relations, thought in international relations theory, is that state interests have to be understood in the context of their identities, right? We can't separate the two. Identities, interests are defined in the context of ideas, in the context of beliefs and the identity of a particular state. So the argument that a state is driven by interest doesn't really tell us very much. It doesn't tell us where these interests come from, what is the basis of its interest. And it is here that we need to look at the state's identity and its beliefs to understand what its interests are and where these interests come from. And so here I would argue that this, if we look at ideas, identity and interest in this manner, this suggests, or I would argue that this suggests that even India's interest-driven humanitarian policy and programs need to be situated in the context of its identity, beliefs, and values. So the argument here is that even where India's humanitarian practices are driven by specific political, economic, or strategic goals, India's understanding of the function, scope, and the principles of humanitarian assistance are still based on India's identity as a post-colonial nation and its beliefs about the role and responsibility of the affected state vis-a-vis that of the international community. Right, so to put that slightly differently, even while the allocation of humanitarian aid, the decision-making about where India should provide humanitarian aid is closely related to India's political and security interests, the manner in which that aid is provided, the conceptualization of the function of aid, the scope of aid, the operating principles of aid are still very, very closely related to India's identity, its beliefs, and its history. And so in that, I think we do have a normative framework for India's humanitarian policy. It is not purely an interest-driven policy. It is interest-driven, but the manner in which that interest is operationalized or implemented on the ground is still closely related to India's identity and its beliefs and its history. So, even while its programs might be driven by political interests, they're at the same time reflective of its belief about international order, resting on a system of self-regulating and sovereign states. Its humanitarian programs therefore do not seek to influence the process of social transformation in the recipient states or to promote particular sets of values or ideology. Humanitarian assistance is thus seen as the provision of necessary goods and services, not as a means of building peace, democracy, or human rights. Shamsaran argued, for an example, that as a flourishing democracy, India would certainly welcome more democracy in our neighborhood. But that too is something that we may encourage and promote. It is not something that we can impose on others. Pratap Bhanu Mehta similarly argues that while India certainly believes that democracy is a desirable value and that the only meaningful solution to security threats such as terrorism is the building of open and inclusive societies, it is unlikely to elevate this political and sociological assessment of where security threats come from to a principle of Indian foreign policy. So the point that I'm trying to drive at by looking at the factors driving Indian foreign policy is to say that even while India's humanitarian policy is driven by political and security interests, there is still a broader humanitarian framework, a normative framework that is a form of state-based humanitarianism. That form of state-based humanitarianism has a couple of, and just in way of confusion because now I have 5 minutes left. And this model of state-based humanitarianism is based on the principles of sovereignty and non-interference. It's based on a request by the recipient state. It's in line with demands and needs identified by the recipient state. And it's focused on strengthening national capacities and national capabilities and is dispersed through bilateral channels. And even where India has violated the principle of non-interference where its national interests have been at stake, particularly in South Asia, even where it has violated non-interference and even where it has violated the sovereignty of the state, this has not been the motivating factor has not been to promote democracy or to promote human rights. It has still been to promote an order within a system of self-regulating states within the international system. So the implication for India's humanitarian donorship is that India is likely to promote a form of humanitarianism that is compatible with a pluralist understanding of international order, one based on the system of sovereign states. And it's also likely to contain the solidarist impulse driving the work of maximalist humanitarian agencies. It is also unlikely to delegate or outsource its humanitarian donorship to Indian non-governmental organizations or abandon bilateral channels entirely in favor of multilateral contributions to humanitarian agencies. Just as a final concluding point, so some gatekeepers of the international humanitarian system have expressed concern about the fragmentation of the formal humanitarian system, the undermining of humanitarian principles, and the blurring of lines between political and humanitarian action as southern donors become more and more important on the international stage. But recent scholarship on humanitarianism has already demonstrated that politics is central to humanitarianism, that humanitarian assistance has political consequences as it injects resources among scarcity, it legitimizes and empowers certain actors while disempowering others, and it alters the calculations and the strategies of combatants and introduces international norms and values into a particular society. The maximalist form of humanitarianism also involves the politics of transformation, though a particular kind of politics embedded in liberal values and claims for global citizenship extending beyond sovereign borders. Critical studies of humanitarianism have also noted how humanitarianism acts as a governance mechanism, regulating the relations between the North and the South, how it helps legitimize and perpetuate the structural inequality of the current international order, and how it's one of the key instruments of a hegemonic liberal order. Once we understand the humanitarianism of the current international system and the politics of that system as deeply intertwined, the concern about the nature of humanitarianism practiced by southern donors, such as India, I think is better framed as one of competing politics rather than one of competing humanitarianisms. Reframing this debate in terms of competing politics rather than competing humanitarianism highlights the underlying contestation about the principles governing the relations between states, the requirements of international order and individual justice, and the nature and scope of domestic and international responsibility towards distant others. So rather than attempt to socialize southern donors into the norms and values of the former humanitarian system, the current moment, I believe, provides an opportunity to consider and reframe humanitarianism in terms of a contested politics and international society. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Urvashi. For me personally, it was delightful to have a restatement of Nehruvian values as the framework of India's foreign policy and humanitarian age. I thought Nehru had been forgotten, and it's really refreshing to hear a scholar talking about the centrality of ideas and a normative framework for humanitarian aid. There was one small question which you don't have to answer immediately, but which has bothered me because repeatedly, given that the Indian government has allowed private companies to buy land in sub-Saharan Africa and set up infrastructure, very often I was told by friends that, well, in return for a use of their minerals and power and other resources, we build a presidential palace or build a flyover or give them cash. And this is cause of great resentment, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where friends have been arguing that India has become a sub-imperialist power. So on the one hand, you have government extending aid on principles that Urvashi mentioned, non-intervention, respect for sovereignty and building capacity rather than intervening in the affairs of states. On the other hand, you have the private sector increasingly pushing the ambitions of Indian entrepreneurs to, I think a particularly nasty case is that of Ethiopia, where private capital has bought up huge chunks of land. And of course, leaving. So I was wondering whether how these two are reconciled, but we won't, you don't have to answer it immediately, but thank you. That was really delightful.